Hi, I'm Micah Halpern. Thank you for joining me today as I do some thinking out loud. Our first segment is called Background Briefing. The first thing I've been thinking about is, and it should be obvious to everyone who knows me, is the situation in Israel. The situation is an expression that's used, hamatzav it's called in Hebrew. It's the situation. It's what's going on right now. Now, until Israeli leadership feels confident that they have destroyed the threat to their citizens and to the country emanating out of Gaza, there is no doubt that this issue, the conflict with Hamas, will continue. And will continue until Israeli leadership actually feels confident enough that they will not have to do the exact same thing again in 6 months or a year. And this becomes an important challenge because the reality is that it's not just expensive, it's tremendously draining on the community and on the country. So the Gaza conflict between Israel and the Palestinians will continue to be waged. There's no doubt about it. While many voices, elected voices, leadership voices, media voices for sure, analytical voices, and those voices actually get me most because those are my colleagues, analysts that don't know anything about what's going on, are saying things that are totally preposterous. And the voices, of course, of Vox Populi, which are the people on the street. The street is the expression in Arabic which is used to try to also explain what's going on and how the pulse of this community is. Now, they were quick to blame Israel. Israel did not provoke this conflict. That should be absolutely clear to everyone. It's easy to blame the overwhelming military force, which is Israel. It's easy to blame the proverbial Goliath in the battle with David. But to do so, to propagate an untruth, is a problem. Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the PIJ, kicked off this conflict with a barrage of rockets shooting through the air from Gaza into Israel. And that should be obvious. Now, the numbers are mind-boggling. Over 1,800 rockets flew into Israel in less than 48 hours. That's 2 days. That's a remarkable amount. Okay, 1,800 rockets flying from Gaza into Israel. What is Israel supposed to do? Clearly, Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad are sitting on a huge stockpile of rockets. That there's no question about, because they've shot thousands of them at Israel. And right now, they are strutting their stuff. They actually believe that they've brought Israel to their knees. That because of the few, and that's way too many, the few amounts of casualties and deaths that occurred in Israel, that Hamas and Islamic Jihad have something to say, that they have a major place at the table now. It's wrong. Hamas and Islamic Jihad want to announce to the world that they have been successful in their conflict with Israel. But more specifically, they want to announce it to their own population that Gaza is a significant player in Palestinian events. Fatah, the leader of the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem, has long been the dominant force in Palestinian politics. Hamas has, for years, tried to overturn their rule and would have had the election actually been taking place as it was scheduled to in the end of May. But the reality is that that's not taking place because the Palestinian leadership from Fatah, especially Mahmoud Abbas, chose not to go to elections and lose. You never go to an election and lose when you're not a democratic force. And so Fatah canceled the election. Canceling because Hamas was actually winning in all the polls. But it's not just the polls. Anyone who saw what was going on realized that Hamas had more popularity than Fatah. So as rockets roared overhead, protests took place on the ground. Fueled by the holiday of Ramadan and the last days of Ramadan, which are called Eid al-Fitr, always a contentious time between Palestinians and Israelis, and by the eviction of 7 families in East Jerusalem over a rent dispute. Repeat, over a rent dispute, which was dealt with in the Supreme Court. And it just over time actually allowed for this to happen right now. It's very poor timing, there's no question about it. The protests spread throughout Jerusalem and Israel. Those were internal protests having nothing to do with the Hamas issue in Gaza. Jerusalem is without a doubt a tinderbox of emotion and ideology. For Palestinians of all political stripes, for Jews all around the world, Jerusalem is the centerpiece. For Christians, Jerusalem is the centerpiece. But what happens is that there's a conflict because for Muslims it's also a centerpiece. Gaza is not at all near Jerusalem. Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad chose the venue to stake their claim and assert their power as leaders of the Palestinians. And as a result, they launched rockets from Gaza into Israel itself. They actually attempted to hit Jerusalem several times, which is in and of itself a very difficult task. And Israel, the only country in the world to call its military not an army but a defense force, and I've spoken about this before on JBS. The IDF stands for Israeli Defense Forces. They retaliated. The sole purpose of the IDF is defense, not offense. U.S. Secretary of State Tony Blinken released a statement indicating that Israel has the right to defend itself. Of course they have that right. You didn't need the United States to say that. President Biden said the same thing. Yes, they have the right. But Blinken, Secretary of State Blinken, qualified his comments, and this is very important, saying that Israel should, and I'm quoting here, take extra care, unquote, not to harm civilians. This is critical, and I'll talk about this later on in some of my thoughts. The question begs asking, why the caveat? Why did Blinken have to say Israel should take extra steps, be specifically, all the much more cautious to not to harm civilians? How would the United States react if 1,800 rockets were shot into Texas from Mexico or from Canada into New York? The parallel is logistically accurate. How would they react to 15, 18, 2,000 rockets in 2 days? Israel goes to tremendous lengths to keep their citizens safe, and just as great lengths to assure that the innocent civilians of their enemies are not hurt, even to the point where they will jeopardize the lives of their soldiers to save and protect the lives of their enemies' civilians. Some might even argue that they handicap themselves by taking away the element of surprise. Israel actually sends SMS text messages to the phones in the target area and to wherever the attack may be. In Gaza itself, around the area. They clear the area out. And so they advise them that they need to evacuate because an airstrike is coming. Again, I'll talk about this in greater detail later on when I actually give a specific example of what was going on. And it's downright funny, in certain ways, humorous, that these alerts are being presented. Israel drops leaflets in Arabic alerting the population of the upcoming airstrike. And when they conduct their strikes, they are surgical. The strikes are aimed specifically at weapons depots, at Hamas and PIJ leadership, and not at civilians. It's remarkable. I was watching a video, and I actually saw the rocket, the missile, come from the helicopter, go straight down and hit a car that was moving. As the car explodes, all the other cars around it keep going. They just keep going. No one was hit around it. That is remarkable. And so, imagine a military strategy that gives up the weapon of surprise in order to save innocent lives. The innocent lives of your enemy, no less. This action is taken by Israel, and it's taken by almost no other country. I can think of no other country in the world that does exactly that actually takes out the element of surprise, because their enemy cares so little about innocent lives of their own population. That's not the case with Israel. Israel actually cares about the innocent lives of their enemy's population. They didn't do anything to cause this. These Palestinian terrorists operate within civilian urban environments in order to do exactly that, to handicap and hamstring Israel. They shoot their rockets and store their rockets in schools and hospitals and in UN facilities, in media centers, Western media centers, even in places, let's say, where the AP was housed or Al Jazeera was housed. That was one of their major centers that was taken out by Israel. But they took out the media center too. Of course, they took out the building. But Hamas had its centerpiece there. The rockets being fired from Gaza into Israel are unguided. And this is an important moral and ethical difference. It's a game of point and shoot. Wherever the rocket lands, wherever they fall, the operation is a success. Why? These rockets are the weapons of terrorists. They want to terrorize people. It's more important for them to terrorize Israelis than to actually kill them. It's good if they kill them, they think, but terrorizing them is more important. They're not aimed and they're not calibrated. They're often homemade. The fear factor that they introduce in Israelis and also is a fundamental Palestinian terrorist goal. Not so long ago, Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad imported their rockets. Gifts from Iran. They were snuck in via tunnels under the border with Egypt or by boats coming in from the Mediterranean Sea. Now this becomes an important element because what happened is that strategically Egypt became a target of the terrorists in Gaza. And as a result, they coordinated with Israel in order to prevent the importing of these rockets and other tools and weapons that were being used against Egyptians, especially in the Sinai, but in other places. So what happened is they coordinated with Israel, and hence they shut the borders. They shut down those tunnels. The Palestinians, it all changed because of it. The Palestinian cause is no longer the darling of the Muslim, Arab, Middle East, especially Egypt. Egypt has clamped down on their borders and below the ground. They knew where the tunnels were. They closed them. Other countries are no longer facilitating the Palestinian conflict with Israel also. They may be condemning Israel right now. But in general, all of those who signed agreements with Israel are actually in cooperation. They are not defending and protecting the Palestinians. Now, these homemade rockets are built from designs supplied by Iran. That is critical. Not materials necessarily. Some materials are smuggled in, but most of them are homemade. Most worrisome for Israel is the long-range rockets that they put together, capable of traveling 120 miles. It puts these rockets in range of port cities like Haifa in the north, one of Israel's largest and most populated cities. These rockets include the R-160, the M302D, and the M302B. They have the Burak 100 rocket, and they have a lot of them actually. Other rockets they have are the J-80s, the M75, and the Fajr 5. They're much shorter range. These can hit Israel's Ben Gurion airport. They have about a 30-mile range, which is in the center of Israel itself, and in cities like Tel Aviv, and the north and south of Tel Aviv, actually, between 20 miles north and south of Tel Aviv, 2/3 of Israel lives. 2/3 of Israel resides in a very small area on the coastal plain. Finally, Hamas has 5,000 to 6,000 short-range rockets. They're rockets that go about 10 miles. Many of those rockets, by the way, never make it out of Gaza. They actually destroy Gazans' internal structures all the time. Israel obviously doesn't go and shoot those down. They don't have to, because they can see from the start that they're not going to make it out. Some of them will hit Israeli communities near the border, though. The bulk of those rockets are actually the Badr 3 and the Qassam rocket. You've heard that name before. And they have a 10-mile range, which is very short, but extremely effective. Intel sources in Israel estimate that Hamas had upwards of 8,000 rockets. I would guess the number was probably closer to 10 to 12. In terms of soldiers on the ground, Hamas has about 40,000 fighters. Palestinian Islamic Jihad has about 9,000. That's a total of about 50,000 fighters. Hamas needs to feel central in their cause to fight for the Palestinian people. But this time, they may have overshot their goal. Israel will not stop targeting Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad until they have been rooted out, until Israel is convinced that they no longer have the capability of striking again in the near future. And Israel has no interest in being right back in the same place in 6 months. So one should always note this is the decision-making process of the Israeli leadership. It's not a political decision. It's not simply a military decision. It's literally a wall-to-wall decision of leadership. And it happens every time there's a conflict. They will not stop the conflict until they know that their citizens are safe. The tide of the conflict actually turned when Israeli citizens were being killed. And when the number of dead Israelis reached 7, Israel changed its tactics. 7 Israelis is 7 deaths too many for Israel. And as a result, that's when they actually decided to up the intensity. And they will continue that intensity and have continued that intensity in other conflicts also. They will continue to do that until they feel that their society is safe. Coming up next, points of view. This column deals with Israel and with Hamas and with the violence that has been unleashed between Jewish and Arab citizens of Israel. Let's start. And it's critical to get a sense of what's going on in terms of this, because the thesis is to suggest that the internal conflict between Israelis, Israeli Arabs, and Israeli Jews is far more dangerous, far more problematic, far more worrisome than the conflict from the outside with Hamas. And that's something that's become a theme. This column is written by Tomer Persico and was published on May 14th, 2021. As I said, it's from the JTA, the Jewish Telegraph Agency. Now, the column is entitled, Jewish-Arab Violence in Mixed Cities is More Frightening Than Rockets. It's subtitled, I grew up in a mixed Jewish-Arab city. Violence there frightens me more than rockets from Gaza. Now, what Tomer does is he begins to explain this conflict, but you have to understand that there are a significant amount of cities in Israel that are Arab Jewish cities, where they live next to one another, with one another, interspersed with one another, interwoven with one another. And that is an important element, and they're all Israeli citizens. This is how Tomer begins. When I was growing up in Haifa, the city's mixed population was a steady background, often overlooked rather than noted with wonder. Jews and Arabs lived, worked, and raised children side by side, at times together. As a part of a secular family, I remember driving to the Arab neighborhoods to buy pita bread during Passover, when supermarkets in Jewish neighborhoods are forbidden by law to sell it. Winter included heading to Christian area on Christmas to enjoy the decorations and catch a whiff of the cosmopolitanism. This is, by the way, just a spectacular description of coexistence and true symbiosis. Tomer had no problems recognizing that there were two different cultures, and he was a culture that he was going to visit, a culture that lived right next to him, and that was important for him. Of course, there were problems at that period and that time, as there are today. But nonetheless, there was a symbiosis that existed. And so Tomer continues, and he begins and continues to explain the internal violence is far more troubling in his eyes than the Hamas rockets. And he writes, as an Israeli, the events of the last few days in Lod, Jaffa, Accra, and other mixed cities are much more worrying than another round against Hamas. However, horrendous. Over the last decade, the conflict with Hamas has taken the shape of a clash between two states. However asymmetrical the balance of power is, it is a war of attrition that no Israeli expects to come to an end when this particular round of violence is through. What's happening in Israel's cities is fundamentally different, as the Israeli military is apparently acknowledging, with reports, that it is prepared to end Gaza cross-border fighting to quell Jewish-Arab clashes within the country. The violence is a terrible blow to the paradigm that existed in Israel for decades. And this is important for me to explain to you, that for years, when Arabs, and it's decades, so for years, when Arabs who were citizens of Israel, remember, especially those who lived in these mixed cities, they're citizens of Israel, so they have all the benefits and responsibilities of Israeli Jews. They're similar. What they don't do is serve in the army. But they get the same benefits of all, especially health benefits, education benefits, all the things that they have. And they are a part of the, they had a very charmed life relative to the Palestinians that were living in the West Bank. So those who lived in mixed cities were content with their lives. They had a very affluent life and led very good lives. But they also realized that the best of the benefits that they had when they were living in this democracy called Israel, albeit a Jewish democracy. Now, Tomer writes and explains that it's important to make a distinction and recognize the power of these distinctions, quite beyond the disintegration of public order with Jewish cars set ablaze by Arab rioters and Arab shops smashed by Jewish extremists. The very fabric of our society is torn. As of now, Lod has borne the brunt of the attacks, with synagogues torched and Jewish families hiding in their own houses for fear of violence from their neighbors. This catastrophic eruption of aggression could have been foreseen, but was by no means inevitable. It has to do with the long-term neglect of the Arab citizenry in Israel by the state. But that's really only a very broad background. Now Tomer explains that families who were friends just a few days ago are now petrified of the other. And that is a scary reality to live in. Both Jews and Arabs living in Israel petrified of their neighbors. He writes, "The results are disastrous, a collapse of the social fabric and indeed of law and order. Lynch mobs from both peoples are pursuing victims in the streets, and families who were only a week ago living peacefully side by side are terrified of each other." Now he concludes. The conclusion is easy to prescribe, but very hard to apply, and that's the case with all kinds of suggestions and analysis. I do it all the time. It's easy to say something, it's really hard to apply it. Like all real introspection, seeing the problem is easier than fixing it. And in reality, that's really what Tomer is doing. He's actually seeing the problem, but fixing it takes a society, and that will not be easy. He writes, "Since neither population is going anywhere, Israelis will learn to live together. Life has its ways, and neighbors find theirs to coexist. The collision of identity and historical hurt, however, unavoidably endangers an intense trauma. Right now, Israel's Jewish and Arab citizens are pressing each other's deepest points of suffering, deepening their anguish. The long process of healing requires an honest attempt at more equitable relationship between the state and its Arab citizens. But each side must learn to recognize and be much more attentive to the other's identity and sensitivities." In other words, and this is me talking, these once friendly, now warring neighbors know how to push each other's buttons. Coming up next, commentary through cartoons, where pictures tell the story. The first cartoon is simply funny. It pokes fun at our kids who learn from all different kinds of items on their screen. But it's their phones and their iPhones and their iPads that they are really interested in more than anything else, even if they're learning through their iPhones and iPads. In this case, a teacher is in front of a class teaching. Suspended from the ceiling is a huge iPhone or iPad. And she's standing and teaching as if on the phone. In other words, being seen through the screen of the suspended false phone. Parents are looking on, and one says to the other, "Looks silly, but the kids are finally listening to her." In other words, they can only really relate through these silly screens and boxes. That's how they approach the world, even education. Next up is one of the many cartoons that depict Hamas as destroying any sense of peace. And there were dozens and dozens of these cartoons that have emerged over the last week and a half as one scours the internet. A dove is strapped to a Hamas rocket, and obviously it's going to be destroyed. In the next cartoon, the squad, that is the 4 congresswomen, are seen as cheerleaders for Hamas. They shout out and spell the name Hamas, Hamas. In the background are rockets flying towards Israel. It's funny and a little pitiful also that these congresswomen have become such advocates for a clearly terrorist group. And that's something that needs to be focused on a little bit. In other words, they're not advocating just for Palestinian rights. They're advocating for Hamas. And Hamas does not deny their terrorist objectives. So it becomes an interesting question that we have to push on, I think. This last cartoon is very true. A child is standing in the middle of a bullseye on the roof and asks the Hamas terrorists, "But if we shoot at Israel from our home, won't they target this location?" The terrorist answers, "We're counting on it." That is very telling. It's telling because the cartoonists has brought the exact expression that the terrorists hide and shoot from innocent civilians' homes. In a moment, more of my own perspective and a few predictions. I watched the Israeli Air Force demolish a 14-story building that was a center for Hamas activity. The building was used especially for planning and communications. The video I watched was shot from a neighboring building. The media felt so secure that Israel would have such pinpoint accuracy that they would shoot their video of the downing of the building from only literally across the street and down the block. And that accuracy is mind-boggling when you think about it. It came down in 3 stages, 3 different shots. They shot their tape right there at the demolition. Now, recognize, if you don't do this accurately, these kinds of things, I don't know if you've seen them in other places, what they do is the building implodes. It goes straight down where it is. It doesn't explode out. If you don't do it right, it explodes out and you've got real damage. Israel was indeed accurate. As always, Israel text messaged people to get them out of the building. I watched and listened on the ground in Gaza. I'm watching what's happening in Gaza as Israel called the guard of that building and asked him to evacuate the building. Israel asked, how long would it take? He responded, 2 to 3 hours. They said, good. And then they said, we'll call back to confirm in 2 to 3 hours that everyone is safely out of the building. Now, this is a remarkable idea. I'm watching it and hearing it with my own ears as they're having the conversation in Gaza, right? Israeli intelligence is calling them. They're having this whole dialogue back and forth as he's running to get people out of the building. Even in war and conflict, Israel maintains a respect for the lives of their fellow human beings. And that is critical in terms of understanding this, especially because of the people who are so critical of Israel. In other words, it can't be. Israel is fighting a war against terrorists and fighting it with as much humanity as possible. Most local media were working for foreign outlets covering this conflict, and they're extremely biased. They did not even realize that by telling this particular story, the story of how that building collapsed and how close they were, was actually proving Israel's point, not Hamas's point. Had they thought about it, they would probably have done it differently. They thought of it as only Israel is destroying a 14-story building, not that how close they were to it and how safe they were given Israel's accuracy. We've been thinking out loud about a lot today. Now that you know what I've been thinking, let me know what you're thinking. Email me at micah@jbstv.org. Tweet me at Micah Halpern. Tell me what you think. Before we end, let me leave you with one piquante piece of information. In the background of almost everything I've been talking about today was a discussion about Sheikh Jarrah. So I thought it would be appropriate to find out a little bit about Sheikh Jarrah and tell you a little bit about what it is. And after all, it is the focal point of some important conflicts right now. So I want to give you some history of the community, of its name and its role over the years, and give you a sense of what it's all about. Now, I draw this from several sources. One source, obviously, is internet source, even of Wikipedia. So there's a nice entry on the Wikipedia there also. So here's a bit more information and details and insight about the Arab neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah. It's originally a village named after Hussam al-Din al-Jahari, who lived in the 12th century and was an emir and the personal physician to none other than, you guessed it, Salah ad-Din, or Saladin as he's called, who's the military leader whose army liberated Jerusalem from the Crusades. And actually it's sort of weird. The whole history of Saladin is a great history to understand because he was actually a mercenary and he was hired in order to do it. But that's a different story and a discussion for another time. Sheikh Hussam received the title Jarrah in Arabic. Jarrah actually means healer or surgeon in Arabic, even today's Arabic. Jarrah means a doctor, a surgeon. Sheikh Jarrah was established there a zawiya. A zawiya is an angle or a corner, but that's actually not what it means. It actually means a small mosque or a school that was tucked away. There was a school or a mosque that was created there, the zawiya, and Jarachia Sheikh Jarrah. And so there was this mosque school in Sheikh Jarrah. Now, Sheikh Jarrah was actually buried on the grounds of the school, and hence a tomb was set up for him and built in 1201. It became a destination for worshippers and for others, visitors. And there was this 2-story stone building incorporating a flour mill, and opposite the tomb in the 17th century, other things emerged as a result of it, but the modern neighborhood itself emerges in a slightly different fashion. In 1865, a whole group of people began to gradually create a residential center, sort of a suburb just outside the walls of the city of Jerusalem itself. So once they're outside the walls, there's a whole different contrast and existence that comes into play. So it was a residential center for Jerusalem Muslims elite, particularly the Al-Husayni family. Al-Husayni, a name that you should recognize. After the 48 War, the Arab-Israeli War, that is, which was the War of Israel's independence, it bordered no man's land, the area between Jordan and East Jerusalem and Israel's West Jerusalem. So it was right on the border between Jordan and in Israel, but it was in Jerusalem. Jerusalem, that stayed that way until 1967, the Six-Day War, when Israel conquered the area. Most of its population today are Palestinians. The people in Sheikh Jarrah are actually refugees expelled from Talbiya, the neighborhood in Talbiya, in 1948 in Jerusalem. So that's a little bit of history about the story of Sheikh Jarrah. Thank you for thinking out loud with me, Micah Halpern. Let's think out loud again next week on JBS.